Awesome, and we are live with a bit of a delay. Thank you everybody for joining in this evening. Apologies for the delay. It's not really a remote presentation if we don't have a few technical glitches, but we are now up and running and ready to go. So thanks for coming along to the Perth Azure user group this evening, where tonight we have Damian Brady, who's going to be talking about deploying to Azure with GitHub Actions. Before I introduce Damian, just a quick note as well about upcoming events. We will have another event coming up next month in May. So 11th of May, mark it off in your diaries. We will be talking about security and Azure. And we may be actually having an in-person speaker for that one. So 11th of May, keep an eye out. That one will be announcing soon. But tonight we have Damian, who is not in person. He is joining us from the other side of the country in Queensland, in not quite lockdown, but still have to wear masks inside. For those of you who don't know Damian, he is a cloud advocate for Microsoft who specialises in DevOps and MLOps. Is well known, well, has been well known on the conference circuit, except for the last year when he stopped talking at as many conferences, and is also one of the organisers for DDD Brisbane. So, Damian, I'm going to hand over to you because everyone's here to learn about Azure. So I'm going to share your screen and then drop off, and I'll let you get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. So hi everyone, thanks for letting me join on the other side of the country. I sometimes end up saying on the other side of the planet, but it's not this time, which is great. Speaking to some other Aussies, so that's lovely. I'm going to talk today about deploying to Azure with GitHub Actions, and there's a lot of stuff, a lot of directions that I could go with GitHub Actions, but I'm going to focus on Azure for sure, but I think it's beneficial at the start to talk a little bit about Actions, what it does, how it works, how you can use it, and things like that, and then focus in on how you can use it for Azure. So GitHub Actions, great, very exciting stuff. What is it though, and how can you use it? So if you haven't used GitHub Actions before, but you are familiar with other CI/CD platforms like Jenkins and Azure DevOps or Azure Pipelines, any of those things, it's a pretty similar thing. Essentially, all these pipelines are really just orchestrators. They will run tasks one after the other, usually centered around building, testing, and then deploying your applications. GitHub Actions is very much the same, but it wasn't actually intended originally to be a CI/CD platform. GitHub Actions is great at CI/CD, but that's not actually what it was originally for. There is these days a heavy CI/CD bias, but originally it was designed to kind of automate any kind of action that occurred based on anything that happened in your repository. So some of the original ideas were around when somebody leaves an issue or comments on an issue or closes an issue, it does something else. It triggers a build or a tag or something like that. So it wasn't really centered around I commit code, I build and deploy. But that's mainly what it's used for these days. So it's not just CI/CD, but you might not even realize that based on the documentation that's on GitHub itself. They really kind of focus around that automation, continuous integration, continuous delivery. So I'm going to talk about that mainly because that's really where Azure comes in anyway. But the best way to do that, I think, is just to kind of do some stuff, right? So I'll just jump over. We'll see if we can get our demo up. Here we go. So this is, and just ping me, and Amy can probably write something in the private chat if that's not zoomed in enough. I'm going to err on the side of super zoomed in anyway, just to help. So this is an example of a build that I've got for a .NET application called Tailwind Traders. And if you've watched any of the Microsoft stuff in the last year or so, you might have seen this application. We use it as a demo app a fair bit. The application itself isn't really that important, but if you're interested in it, you can go to, I think, Tailwind Traders. If I can spell traders.azure websites net or something like that. I'm sure it's somewhere like that. It's basically just a web application that is used to sell hardware. So think, Hammer Barn or something if you're familiar with Louis. But the application itself, not really important. It's how we actually get it out into Azure, which is the important part. So the GitHub page talks a lot about CI/CD, automation of CI/CD, and you can find out a lot more detail there. But let's have a look at some of these applications that we've got. We don't need the Azure Pipelines one. We've got this .NET Core build, and it's basically going to compile our application and just make sure that it's okay. Before I actually go into the one I've got and start to build on it, so we're deploying, I'm just going to show you what it looks like in GitHub when you want to build a new workflow, a new pipeline. So if you go to Actions, any repository, and then go to Actions, they'll all have the Actions tab now. If you click on New Workflow, it's going to give you a bunch of templates that you can use to choose how you're going to actually deploy your application, or build your application. So some examples, if it's a Node application, you might use these ones. Dino, I think, is Node just with TypeScript. Then we've got deploying Node to Azure, deploying to Alibaba Cloud, ECS, GKE, GCE. So it really doesn't have a preference around where you want to deploy GitHub specifically. It'll let you deploy anywhere. We're going to deploy to Azure, obviously, so I could use that deploying Node to Azure Web Apps, but I'm using C#, so I'll use something else. There's a ton of these continuous integration workflows. I'm just going to choose one at random just to show you what you get out of the box. I'll choose the first one. And so what it gives you is this nice UI for building your workflow definition. So workflows are all defined in YAML, which is a pretty consistent thing across a lot of different tools now. Azure Pipelines does YAML. All of the Kubernetes stuff is based in YAML. It's a pretty familiar tool for people doing CI/CD. So GitHub Actions actually does YAML as well. And it's given me an example one, which is just going to trigger on, it's given it a name, it's going to trigger on a release being created rather than a commit. So I could obviously change that to say, on push as well, and even define, the branches that I want it to push on, to build on and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff I can do with those triggers. But for the moment, I'm just showing you this one. So the triggers is the first part. Then we have a collection of jobs. We can name those jobs. The first one is build. It runs on an Ubuntu agent. We have the choice of Ubuntu, Windows, or Linux, and then you can specify internally for those, like what versions of Windows, what versions of Ubuntu. You can even run your builds on your own container definitions or container images that it will run inside these VMs as well. So there's a lot of control over that as well. Or you can run your own self-hosted agents. So I could run the build on this machine if I wanted to, or a build server or something inside my firewall. There's a lot of options there too. Each job has a collection of steps, and steps can either use this users and use an action that has been defined by GitHub or by the community. So checkout is an action, set up node is an action, or I can just run a script. So this will just run, because we're running on Ubuntu, this will run in Bash. So all this does a checkout, sets up node with a particular version. So we're passing in variables, and then runs a couple of command lines. We have a second job, which is dependent on the first one. It runs on Ubuntu as well, and so on. So we got all of this kind of template to get us started. If you don't want to type all of this stuff, the marketplace has a ton of actions as well. So if I was using, let's use Azure, for example. If I wanted to deploy that to Azure SQL, a DAC pack or something like that, I can choose that task and it'll give me some examples of that action, and it'll give me some examples of what I can put in my YAML file. So we get a really good start. What it actually does is puts a YAML file in .github/workflows. And if there is a YAML file that exists in there, GitHub Actions will just pick it up in that repository and work based on what the triggers are and things like that. So I've already got one, so I'm not going to use this. I'm going to jump over to VS Code, and I've got one for my .NET Core application. This is actually really, really similar to the template that you get for .NET Core. It'll trigger on my main branch whenever I push to my main branch. I have a job called build, which runs on Ubuntu. It's .NET Core, so it can. I have environment variables that I've set as well. The CI environment variable is just very useful for telling it to ignore all of my warnings. Fantastic little tool there. It's checking out my code. It's doing a setup.NET Core, specifying the version, setup node, and then running .NET Restore, .NET Build, .NET Test. And that's all it's really doing. The great thing here as well is in VS Code, kind of with a couple of extensions, just search for GitHub Actions in the extensions. You can say that I'm actually going to do, GitHub Actions one, and it will do IntelliSense on a lot of this as well. So I can say name, and then run is one of the options, or with the working directory that it runs on and things like that. So you get nice IntelliSense in VS Code pretty easily as well. Right, so I'm doing a build and a test. The way that Actions works behind the scenes is when I commit this change to a main branch, it'll pick up this action and it'll execute it, or this workflow, and it'll execute all the actions. It does that by spinning up a virtual machine for me on demand just to do this work. And then when it's completed all the work, it tears it down and that's gone again. So here, where I'm doing my installation of dependencies, my build and my test, at the end of this, it's going to write all the logs and push them back up to GitHub so I can see them again. But it's not by default going to push any built code or anything like that up. So it'll tear this down at the end, and all I'll have is my logs and my test results and things like that. If I actually want to deploy it, I'm going to have to tell GitHub that I want to keep the artifacts that it's created. And I might even want to tell it, hey, take those artifacts and deploy them to Azure. So let's just add a couple of things to this. We're going to add a .NET Publish. And that .NET Publish is basically just a command line in Actions, .NET Publish that CS_proj, and I'm going to push it out to this location, staging folder. So I'm going to do .NET Publish, and then I'm also going to do a deployment to my Azure website. So it'll take everything that's in that staging folder that I just dumped it to. It'll use the Azure Web Apps Deploy action, and we'll get into that in a minute. It'll deploy this app name with the secrets, and again, I'll talk about the secrets in a second. And then it'll use the package that I've published to that location. I might actually want to do one more thing as well, and I'm going to do an upload artifact action. Action in there as well. So this basically will take everything that's in that staging folder, and it'll upload it to GitHub Actions with the name drop. So that'll basically say, here's what you built. You can download it later on if you want to inspect what's in it, if something's going wrong, but it'll still do this deployment. Now, this example, I'm not actually going to run it because there's a couple of things wrong with it from a CI/CD perspective. I'm a DevOps guy, and I hate the idea of just building it and pushing it straight out to production. I don't want to do that. I want to kind of do it in two pieces. I want to build my application once, and then I want to deploy it to multiple locations. But just to show you what this does look like, I think I've actually got an action that shows that working. Let's choose the .NET Core one. And then we have this is the first, an example of what it looks like when it's run. So you'll see here, we've got one job called build. It sets up the job, it does .NET Core, node, build, test, and then a post runs. So this is before we made any changes. Once we decided to deploy, the changes we get are, here we go, in deploy. So same thing, just the one job, but we get the uploading of the artifact, deploying to our website, the publish, upload, and then deploy to the website. And we can see all of the logs around this as well. So we can see that when we deploy to the website, it doesn't give us too much information, actually. We can look at the details. When we did the publish, same thing. Here's everything that happened when we did a publish. So we get all these logs. The other thing we get in here as well is we look down at artifacts, and we can see here's our drop folder, and it's 443 meg, which is a decent size for a web application. And we can download that file if we want. It'll offer to download the zip file. So we can see what's in it. We can diagnose problems and so on. But again, this is all doing things in one hit. I want to deploy in multiple jobs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave these ones here, the publish and the upload artifact. And I'm going to, when I've uploaded the artifact, I'm going to call that done for my build. So we've basically created this built, published version that I can deploy to Azure when I want. And then in the next job, I want to deploy to Azure. So let's see where I've got this saved. Nope, that's the wrong one. Wow, that's some pretty cool typing. Let's just create another job. I'm going to do this on the fly. Let's create another job. So we've got a job called build. Let's create a job called deploy. And then it is going to, deploy. It's going to use pretty much the same stuff, actually. So we can just say it's going to run on Ubuntu. Here are the steps. We don't need to check out our code. That's fine. So let's just runs on there. Here are our steps. We don't need that environment variable. And a couple of things we need to do, though. We need to say this is going to depend, so needs build. So that's going to need the results of this build. And then we also need a step which is going to deploy the, download the artifact. And we can do that pretty easily. Thankfully, there's another action which has a very similar name. I'm just going to call it download. And instead of actions, upload, it's download. And I don't really need this whole location. I'm just going to say it's going to go to that staging one. Because I don't have the source code, I don't care about any of that stuff, and I can do that deployment. So this will do the same thing, but it will do it in two different parts. The other thing I might want to do here is specify that this is going to an environment and say this is going to staging, for example. What that will do is it'll tell GitHub that when it does this deployment, it's a deployment to our staging environment. And rather than steps, and I'm just going a little bit off memory here because I should have had a shortcut for this, but I didn't. I believe, sorry, jobs. Yeah, so I have jobs, that build job, and the steps. I can specify instead that I'm going to do a deployment task. So a deployment set of steps rather than jobs. So because my memory's just completely failed me for a second, I'm just going to go back here and we'll look at one of these. So split and deploy. And so we can see there's two of these. I'm going to see if I can find the workflow file so we can see what it should look like. So same thing. We uploaded our artifact. We did a deploy job, which needs the build job. It runs on Ubuntu. Here are our steps. We download the artifact. We deploy to our website. And we have a few extra things in there for the build load as well. So this is all great. It's going to deploy our code. Now I'm just going to really quickly check to see, what we're actually what we're actually doing with this code here. Bear with me for just a second. All right. Let's jump back to VS Code. Okay. Right. So we've got our build step. We've got our deploy step. We're pulling down our artifact, we're deploying to our website. A few things that I didn't mention as well. One is the secrets that we're using right here. So this secret, we need some credentials, obviously, to deploy to Azure, and we'll look into that a little bit more in a minute. But the secret itself is a thing that's stored in GitHub. So if we jump back over to GitHub and go to settings and down to secrets, we can see there's this big collection of secrets that we've got. I'm just using these Azure credentials ones, but the important thing about these is I can't read what those credentials are later on. All I can do is update them if they go stale or if they're not valid anymore, or if I need to cycle them because they've been exposed or something like that. So I can remove them, I can update them, and I can do all of those nice things. Even better, our environments will let us specify. So when we deploy to an actual environment, so if we're deploying to staging, staging will allow us to put environment secrets. So we're able to say in staging, this particular secret is only for a staging environment. So the deployment profile is, the publishing profile is this in staging. The name of the application is this in staging, and change it per environment. The other awesome thing is we have our our environment protection rules as well. So at the moment, I don't have any protection rules set up for this one, but I might want to say I'm going to require that I have to review a change before it goes into my production environment. So simply by virtue of saying this particular job is going to be a deployment job to a production environment, it will stop right there until I've approved it. Or I can say, it's only allowed to go to production after 15 minutes of being in the previous environment. Or it can only come from protected branches. So if I'm protecting my main branch, such that only PRs or pull requests can be pushed into our main branch, I'm only allowed to deploy to production from that main branch. I'm never able to deploy a pull request, for example, to production. Or I can specify individual ones as well. So we can use these environments to kind of specify and control a bit where we go. Right, so those are the actions that we've got. We've got a few that are running. I've done a few other examples in the past. There's a few different things you can do. I'm just going to kind of jump ahead and show you one that's got a bit more in it. This is a really similar one. This is an example of an on-prem to the cloud demo series that we're doing for the DevOps Lab, which is a Channel 9 show. And I have three different jobs here. I have my build job, which produces my artifact, which I've got here. I have a deployment to a test environment, then a deployment to a production environment. And so you can really see these things working here. So if we go to settings and we see our secrets, we can see that we've got database names and website names, but ones that are specific to our test and prod environments. Right? So our environments as well, we can see that we have our production environment with a protection rule and 2 secrets, and our test environment has different secrets. The action itself, so the templated deployment, if I go here and have a look at that workflow file just so you can see what it looks like. You can zoom in a bit more. You can see that we are triggering on a push to our master branch in this case. We're setting some environment variables. We have a build job that does all of our building. We have a deploy to test job, which actually runs on an on-premises server at the moment. So I have self-hosted agent. It requires the build, and it's actually deploying to a resource in that test environment. And it's using deploying to IIS and then deploying to a SQL DAC, but then it goes to production, which depends on deploying to test. So we can't go to production before we've been to test, and it's deploying to a different environment and using those artifacts as well. So a little bit of a more detailed example there, but you can see in the environment as well that when we have gone to production, we can see we can actually trace what's been happening with those as well. So, what's gone to which environment and things like that. All right, that's enough of that stuff. Let's jump back really quickly, and I just want to highlight a few things that I kind of looked at briefly, just to give you a bit more information about those. So number one, when you get started, there's templates that can kind of kick you off and get you going. The other thing that you can see is all the triggers. Now, I didn't talk about the triggers a lot. I will in a second, but there are a huge number of triggers. Effectively, it's kind of an unlimited number of things you can do or you can trigger based on, and I'll mention that really quickly as well in a couple of slides' time. And then we saw dependent jobs as well. So we can really separate our build and our deployment to each environment in dependent jobs to make sure that we don't try to deploy to production before we've gone to our test environment. Now, the actions themselves, there are a huge number of actions. This number here, 7,578 actions, is almost certainly incorrect by now. Let's actually jump back and we'll see what it looks like now. Let's go to this one and have a look at actions. 7,868. So since I last did a version of this presentation, there's been about another 300 actions added. So this slide deck needs to be updated every single time I do the talk, which is fun. So there are a ton of actions. If there's something you want to do that you can't do, then you can always just write a script to do it, or pull down some code and run that code, or something along those lines. It's actually not that hard to write your own actions either. So one other thing that I'll show you is if we grab, I don't know, let's actually grab any of them. So a glow move cards. I have no idea what that is, but here it is. That action, when you define it or when you use it, you'll use this syntax. Uses Axosoft glow action parse links v1. That Axosoft / glow action move card, with parse links there, but move card, that's a repository. So you can have a look to see exactly what they're doing in this repository. It's all open, and then fork from that and try your own version of it, or just create a new one based on this. So those 7,860 something actions that we saw, you can see all of the code for all of them. So writing your own action is not actually a difficult thing to do. There's a lot of examples of it as well. And you don't have to use actions published on the marketplace. You can use actions that are just living in your own private repositories if you want to as well. All right. So huge number of actions and a lot of things you can do. You can basically do anything in response to anything, because the triggers are almost unlimited as well. So if you go to, there's a short link there for the actions triggers. So this is the documentation for triggers. It basically tells you all of the different things that you can do. That big list that you can see down there on the right, probably a little bit hard to read. Reading it's not that important. Each of those is kind of the top level trigger. So there might be issue comment as one of the triggers, but you can specify inside issue comment, a bit more specifications around, what type of issue it is. Or we saw before when we were looking at push, it was enabling us to trigger based on a push to a specific branch. We can ignore paths. We can only include things in certain folders. We can ignore files. We can ignore certain branches. All sorts of stuff that you can do there. So this is a huge number of triggers, but there's much more fine-grained control that you have in it as well. I'll also mention there's two of them up the top right there. They're probably going to be hard to see, but one is called Workflow Dispatch and the other one is called Repository Dispatch. Workflow Dispatch essentially just gives you a button that you can press to deploy your application. So it's a manual trigger. So if you add that as a trigger for your actions workflow, you can just click a button and say, I want to deploy it, or I want to run this workflow essentially. Repository dispatch is exactly the same thing, but with an API endpoint. So if you have a look at, and I'm going to jump back, let's just jump back over here. I'm going to jump back at these actions that I've got here. There's an example for repository dispatch here. And if we look at the that demo dispatch one, and we look at the workflow file, we can see that this is running on repository dispatch, and I've given it a specific type. All I have to do is hit a specific URL, tell it, give it a JSON payload that has this particular name in it, demo dispatch, and then give it a client payload, message or something like that. It'll pull that out. So I can, based on any event from another application, if it can hit an endpoint, an HTTP endpoint, that's all it needs to do to actually kick this off. So repository dispatch is stuff that you can run anywhere from your code, and workflow dispatch gives you a button that you can click to run it manually yourself. So ultimately, kind of unlimited triggers. You can trigger based on anything. Now, one thing I'll say is if you're going to actually use actions and you're not used to it, actions workflows, the workflow syntax can be a little bit tricky. I would recommend going to the documentation. It's a little bit hard sometimes to find the documentation that you need. The way that actions works, it works on context and expressions and things like that inside where it's running. So it gets a little bit tricky sometimes to find out where the information is that you need. So that example of the repository dispatch, where do I find the message that was added there? There was an example I did as well for another presentation where when people leave a comment in an issue, I need to find where that comment lives in the context while I'm running my action. Finding that out can be a little bit tricky. Here's a pro tip. If you have a task, or have an action that's just a run, like a command line one, and use that, echo to JSON github.event, it'll just dump the entire context of the github.event payload. And there's github. All sorts of stuff in there as well. So that's a great way of finding the objects in the context that you have. So while the action's running, where do different values live? Things like what branch I'm in, what the commit message was, who did the commit, things like that. All right, the documentation's all there. It's just a matter of finding it. All right, so I'm going to drill in a little bit more to the deploying to Azure stuff. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier as well. If you have any questions, feel free to relay them. I think this is live on YouTube. I think you can leave comments and things. I'm sure Amy will pick them up. And there's a chat in StreamYard, which we're using, which she should be able to ask me. Or we can just hold them to the end. That's also cool. So deploying to Azure. We had a really brief look at one of the actions for deploying to Azure here. So this was in the Azure/web apps deploy. So that is, one of the examples of, a thing that we can deploy to, right? We can deploy to Azure App Service. So I'm going to use my own advice before, and we're going to go to this repository and just see what we end up with. Let's go here. I should have done GitHub/Azure Web Apps Deploy. So this is the Web Apps Deploy action. So if you really want to know what it does, all the code is there. You can see all of it. It's given me some links to some end-to-end sample workflows. So I can, I can have a look at the end-to-end samples. So there's an example of .NET, Node, Python, Java, using Docker login. So there's a whole bunch of examples. There's full end-to-end ones for .NET, Node, Java with a jar file, Java with a WAR file, Python, PHP. You can deploy PHP to app service or Docker ones, and then full things you can copy and paste. So there's a lot of stuff there. There are a huge number of actions, and I'll just go to github.com/azure/actions, which is kind of the landing page. It's the repository it's kind of the starting point if you wanted to have a look at them. So this isn't an action itself, it's just a repository that helps. And in here, it walks you through all of the actions for Azure, what they do, and they're all open source because all of the actions are, of course. This is all just HTML in here, but it talks about actions for connecting to Azure. So how you use Azure Login, the CLI, Azure PowerShell, ARM deployments, Key Vault, which is another way of storing secrets and getting them back out. Really easy to use. I've used that one before. Deploying web apps, static web apps, app service, serverless apps, building and deploying containerized, Kubernetes, VMs, databases, Azure Policy even, Azure Machine Learning, which is really cool. You can hit Azure Machine Learning and tell it to run some training. You can even use, and I've done this before in examples, in your training code, have used the repository dispatch event. So when you finish training your model, which might take, 2 days, you can use repository dispatch to kick off a workflow back in GitHub where it can pull down that model and deploy it to production as well. So yeah, really cool examples there. Runs in Azure Pipelines if you wanted to use both tools, and then all sorts of stuff. So there's more than 30 officially supported Azure actions. And there's a ton of samples as well. So you'll see if we scroll up a little bit, we should be able to see pretty soon. I'll give you the link for this as well. But there are some starter templates. So various links to starter templates. That, again, is another repository, which is a great way of getting started. So the Actions Workflow Samples ARM gives you some starter templates for ARM. But if you go back to the root of this repository, there's starter templates for all of these. So you don't have to start with, just reading the documentation. You can just copy and paste some of these and change some values. Ton of information there about how you actually use Azure. Now, all of this stuff is very, if you want to deploy to app service, you've got an out-of-the-box kind of action that you can use. But one of the ones I want to draw your attention to is the Azure CLI. So the CLI itself is basically everything that you need to work with Azure regardless. So even if there is no action to use Azure, you can do something like, I'm going to use Ubuntu because I think that's got a more recent version. This is ultimately just using the AZ command line. So you can run this to do anything in Azure essentially, because that AZ command line is either installed on the agents, and it almost always is, or if you need a particular version or something like that, you can actually specify what version of the AZ command line you want. So this gives you access to all of the things that you could potentially be missing as out-of-the-box actions as well. So you don't really have any restrictions deploying to Azure when it comes to running running GitHub Actions. All right, so summary of that little stuff, those little things I put there. Everything is open source. There are more than 30 officially supported Azure Actions, but of course the Azure CLI gives you access to basically all of Azure. Right? You can deploy pretty much anything to Azure if you wanted to using the CLI. And there are a ton of samples. So we want to make sure that you're not just reading documentation and trying to work out how to put it all together. There's end-to-end samples for a whole lot of stuff. If you have any more questions on any of this stuff, I kind of want to make this a little bit more interactive. I haven't really gone anywhere near time, so I'm hoping for a bunch of questions. Even better, if you want me to just try stuff, I'm more than happy to do that. I've got a couple of other things that I'm happy to talk about as well, about some of the detail of how Actions works under the covers, if people are interested. But otherwise, you can always reach me at DamoVisa on Twitter, or even damovisa@microsoft.com works if you wanted to get in touch with me as well. So hopefully Amy hasn't gone out to get herself a drink and she can jump back in. Yeah.
No, I am still here.
Awesome.
And yeah, this is really cool. I definitely need to learn more about GitHub Actions and how they can be properly used. I used them when they first came out. It was really overwhelming I don't know what to do with it, but it's kind of really great because so much of the stuff on Azure, it will now also generate workflow files for you, which is then that I've found makes it a little bit easier. So I'm not having to start from scratch. It will give me a starter and I tweak from there, which is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I did a blog post a little while ago about getting started with GitHub Actions for .NET just from the command line or from Visual Studio or something like that. So rather than right-click publish, which nobody ever uses anymore because it's terrible, right? You should always build a pipeline. It's not terrible, but for a project, you should build a pipeline. A lot of the tooling now builds these actions for you rather than lets you just deploy directly. It'll build a whole pipeline so that you can just automatically do it in the future. I can find a link to that one as well. But while we're talking, anyway.
Yeah, that was really, and I know I've spoken to you about it when I first started trying to do things, and so much of the documentation and the easy route to deploying to Azure was to right-click publish, which I knew was not a good thing. So it's been really amazing how I do a lot of work with Azure Functions and Azure Static Web Apps and that kind of thing, and it just makes it so easy. We've got a bunch of people saying they don't have questions, but your presentation was too good. They don't have any questions after that.
That's what I always assume if there's no questions. Obviously I entered everything. But there's a couple of other things that I don't know whether anybody else finds them interesting, but I find them super interesting about things like how the agents themselves, like what they actually are and how they work and things like that. Which can be really, really handy for things like, is this tool installed on the hosted agent, or am I going to have to install it myself? This thing that I need for my build. First, though, here's the blog post. I guess if you search for that, you'll find it. Otherwise, it's generating a GitHub Actions workflow with Visual Studio or the .NET CLI. That URL is not terribly digestible. So. But it's pretty easy to find. It should be pretty easy to find.
That's okay. I've just chucked that into the chat for everyone as well. We do actually have a question as well. So Chris has asked, is there any best practices on converting from Azure DevOps pipelines to GitHub Actions?
Yes, there kind of is. So right now, and I'm never going to remember this URL, I'm sorry, but it's something like, so let's say Azure Pipelines. Terrible at typing. There's a guy, Sam Smith, I believe, who actually wrote a conversion tool, basically, to take you from pipelines to actions. He's got all the code is open source as well, but you can just go to pipelines to actions.azurewebsites.net and type in your Azure DevOps pipeline YAML, and it'll convert it to GitHub Actions YAML. He says it's about 90% accurate at the moment. So this is a decent starting point. And maybe just to prove it, I'm just going to try and grab an example pipeline. This is all, by the way, not at all planned. So let's just see what this looks like. That one will do. Edit. Oh, yep. Authorize everything from Microsoft. Cool. So let's just grab all of that YAML. So this is a pipeline, Azure Pipelines one. I'll paste it in here as is, git process. And so it's giving me an error. User node 1 doesn't have a conversion path. So I'm going to have to work out what the task is for that. And then I've also got like a strategy for deployments and stuff like that. So this is it's not a basic pipeline. This is a more complicated one. But everything else is the same. On, push, branches, matches this trigger in Azure Pipelines. Variables are env, jobs are stages, and so on. So that's a pretty good starting point. The one thing I will say, though, is that if Azure Pipelines is currently working for you, I wouldn't be in a hurry to move off it necessarily. It's not like there are no plans for it to go anywhere. And I know everybody says, well, you've got two things that do the same job now. Why would you keep both of them around? It's worth understanding that Microsoft has hundreds and hundreds of projects that are very dependent on Azure Pipelines internally. Unless we can make it easy to move all of those to GitHub Actions, we're not going to just cut it off. So Azure Pipelines, Azure DevOps still has about 200 engineers working on it, like almost exclusively. So it's not being abandoned. So if you're using Azure Pipelines, you can be really confident to continue using it. But if you're creating a new one and your code lives in GitHub, GitHub Actions is the place to go. But this is the best tool that I've found so far for this, pipelines to actions.azurewebsites.net. I've used it a ton of times. It's actually really, really handy.
It's really cool as well how it will tell you the bits that it's unable to convert, so you're not left wondering if it's all good. It's like, yeah, look, we couldn't do these things, but we've done the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing is, because it's open source, like, your typical open source project, there's 48 issues open. So you can always submit pull requests as well. So there's 144 closed pull requests. So people actually edit this stuff. So if you find a conversion for something, do Sam a favor and submit a pull request for it too. Yeah.
Yeah. We have another question as well. Timothy has asked, are there certified actions, or is it a matter of knowing who has actions that you can trust?
A little bit of both. So for context, in Azure Pipelines, which is actually runs on the same kind of infrastructure, when Azure Pipelines came along, the extension story was that only trusted developers were able to put stuff in the extensions marketplace. So they took the position where not everybody was allowed to do this, only the people we trust. GitHub went the other way, and they said anybody can create an action, which has obviously led to 7,800 different actions. What they've kind of done to make it a little bit easier to know which ones to trust is you can see the little blue tick. I don't know where they got the idea of a blue tick from, but there's a creator verified by GitHub. So basically, it doesn't mean that the action itself has been tested by GitHub and is proven to work. It means that the publisher, the creator of that action, is trusted by GitHub. So if you look for all the Azure ones, for example, you'll see if I can find my enter key, there we go. All the ones that are by Azure, so all the ones by Azure have the tick on them. If you scroll down far enough, you'll probably find a few that aren't by Azure. So there you go. There's an Azure sign tool by Fluffy Bunny. Fluffy Bunny is not a trusted or created, a verified creator. So you can absolutely use that action. And I use plenty of actions that aren't from verified creators, but just in that case, kind of use it at your own risk. It's a good idea to look at the code to make sure it's not actually doing anything malicious if you are worried about it. Otherwise, stick to the verified creators. The action itself hasn't necessarily been tested, but the person who created the actions is kind of acknowledged by GitHub to be somebody that they trust. So that would be the advice, yeah.
Look, I'd like to hope that any of the actions that Azure are publishing will be trusted and they're not going to do anything dodgy. If we can't trust Microsoft, who can we trust?
I know, right? So, but you look at things like Kubernetes, gosh, Kubernetes. So there are ones by Azure, like Azure does a lot of stuff that goes upstream to Kubernetes as well, and also some other trusted people, but there's just a ton of Kubernetes stuff that came from all sorts of people that does the same thing because they all existed kind of really early on. So these ones might work better for you, but you know, the trusted ones kind of float to the top a little bit. Yeah.
It's definitely really cool and interesting. And yeah, I will have to go and have a look at a bit more about GitHub Actions because yeah, there are so many amazing things that you can do with it. And yeah, not even just with Azure as well. Like GitHub Actions is so powerful and definitely really interesting. Although I'm a little bit disappointed now that I didn't know about the environment variables, the secret variables, because I spent several days trying to work out why my environment variables in Azure weren't working, and I couldn't, for the life of me, find how to set them. So right. I wish I'd known that beforehand.
Just with environments as well, I was having a conversation with somebody today. They're not supported for everything. I think GitHub Enterprise, it's definitely in there. And I think public repositories, it's definitely in there as well. But not necessarily private ones. And I'm not sure whether I've got it the wrong way around, private and public. But yeah, just check the whether it's supported or not. GitHub Enterprise is actually super cheap at the moment anyway. So
yeah, well, I think I've been using it in public repositories because I can never be bothered. I'm not doing anything secret enough that I want to make a repository private, and it means then when I'm asking people for help, I can just go, here's the code.
Yeah, I have two categories of things that I keep private. There's the secret stuff, and there's the stuff I'm embarrassed about. So code quality, yeah.
Yeah, I think I probably need to make some of my repositories private for that reason. Some of the really old stuff. Yeah. Awesome. Well, if there are no more questions, this has been a really great presentation. Thank you very much for joining us, Damo, especially since I know it's much later for you there. So
it is, but that's all right because it means the kids are in bed. So
yes. So this is your chance to have a little bit of peace and quiet and a little bit of sanity time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us for the presentation this evening. Hopefully you've all had a chance to learn some really awesome things about using GitHub Actions and Azure. And thank you once again, Damian, for joining us. We will see everybody next month for the next Perth Azure User Group presentation. So keep an eye out for when we publish that one. Thanks.
Yeah.